As noted, Stephen gets Aquinas wrong, subtly wrong, but wrong. That kind of error and others will be the subject of section 4. Here we will focus on Aristotle and his relation to St. Augustine. From Aristotle, Joyce draws ultimately definitions for beauty, tragedy, comedy, and which forms of art is proper and which improper. He structures his work in a bent sort of way on one of the philosopher's syllogisms, and through strange references that stand out in their oddness, Joyce directs us to Aristotle's theory of creation. Recall the discussion in the National Library following the midpoint of episode 9, Entr'acte, when Buck enters and steals Stephen's audience away. Moments later, Stephen, wielding the big gun in any genetic Shakespeare case, the second best bed evidence, begins to win his listener's attention back. He urges himself with a little chant. I think you're getting on very nicely. Just mix up a mixture of theological, philologico, mingo, minxi, mictum, mingere. We wonder why Stephen randomly begins to conjugate the Latin verb for urination. I urinate, I have urinated, to have urinated, to urinate. This reminds us of Stephen peeing in Proteus, his waters contrasted with nature's, Bloom wiping himself with Philip Beaufoy's Tidbits article in Calypso, and at the other end of the day, Stephen, Bloom, and Molly all peeing, the men displaying their similarity in the arcs of their urine, Molly making music in her chamber pot. These eliminations, not to forget Bloom's flatulence in Sirens and his emission in Nausicaa, focus our attention on Aristotle's concept of spontaneous and natural production, and creation's material and spiritual contingency. Aristotle details 3 species of creation and, according to W.D. Ross, argues that the 3 modes, natural, artistic, and spontaneous, involve similar conditions. However, each form of production is contingent upon the psyche, the soul of the original entity. In other words, female horses birth horses, female humans birth humans. To say something is contingent upon its soul begs the question of the soul's nature. This discussion can get complicated, but to strip Aristotle down to a thumbnail, universals create and particulars are created. Only universals have a soul per se, and that gives them the ability to change themselves and their environment. They are open-ended, as it were. Particulars, on the other hand, are finished. They are the things universals have created. As God creates trees, and each tree is a particular oak or elm, so an artist would create an individual statue, portrait, or book, frozen in stone, paint, or ink, an artifact of the creative process. Consider one of Dante's lessons. The souls in hell have lost their ability to change. They are fixed now, as the poet remembers them, and where he sees them in hell. Dante renders them fixed in mud, frozen as brittle bushes, caught within perpetual flame. Souls on earth, on the other hand, even bad ones like Scrooge, still have the opportunity to change. But how do things change, and how did all this motion get started? Aristotle in his philosophy divided the world into being in motion, things are and things move, and every movement is contingent upon its predecessor, as a child is upon its mother. But Aristotle knew that such a system leads to an infinite regress in which no motion can be first. If everything moving has to be moved by something else, what moved the first mover? Aristotle solved this dilemma by positing a first mover that is not moved. Since the primary mover has no motion or change, nothing needs to account for its motion, so the line of contingency ends. But then, how does a thing that doesn't move something else? Aristotle argued that such a first mover would be absolutely beautiful and move others by the inspiration of its appearance. So why would there be anything ugly in a world created by a perfectly beautiful being? If everything is contingent upon the original soul, shouldn't everything's artifact reflect the maker as if in a mirror? And since the maker was beauty in its absolute, shouldn't anything it make be a species of beauty, just as a baby horse remains a species of horse? Aristotle answers this dilemma with his theory of privation. In brief, only real things exist, negative things don't exist. Consider a hole, it's only a privation of the dirt that could fill it, or had filled it. In the same way, ugly is only a privation of beauty. St. Augustine, about 700 years later, borrowed Aristotle's pagan notions, but dressed them in Christian clothing. In episode 14, Stephen recalls, as saith Augustine too, we are linked up with by a successive anastomosis of navel cords. just as the Bible traces our individual contingency back to the first parents, the only humans with unblemished bellies, Joyce makes the case in The Oxen of the Sun, and specifically in Scylla and Charybdis, that spiritual production, art, too, relies upon its parent contingently, umbilical to umbilical. And through a series of references which link Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, Joyce reminds us of another borrowing by the African bishop. Trying to explain why God created sin, St. Augustine in City of God deferred to St. Paul's teachings in his Roman epistle, chapter 11, verse 32. For God has consigned all men to disobedience, that he may have mercy upon all. Augustine doesn't bemoan this inherited sin, he champions it, resorting to what ethnologist Joseph Campbell calls his famous oxymoron, O felix culpa, Latin, O happy fault. Campbell lists some of the Wake references, a date, 1132 AD, a paragraph in Legal Code, subsection 32, section 11, an interval of time from 11:30 to 2 in the afternoon, a musical composition, and many more. In Ulysses, references include a post office box, Post Office 32, Charing Cross, Bloom's faithful charger, couple of Felix, and of course his infamous Elijah 32 feet per sec is come. We can understand why Joyce compares arts with God's creative act, but why draw our attention to the creation of sin, our happy fault? In the Christian context, we are all souls born into sin, and that sin is the legacy of Eve's disobedience. Augustine is making the case that God didn't create evil. He created us with freedom of choice and hence the ability to sin. Hence, the existence of sin is also evidence of free will. The freedom was good. All else in nature is God. Only we have a soul and the freedom to love him or not. However, with that freedom came doubt. Being creatures of a mixed nature, a composite of both spirit and matter, our privations can be evoked with both spiritual and material temptations. In our own ignorance, sometimes we can't tell the difference. Keep in mind, since God made everything, nothing can be truly ugly. Any ugliness or evil must stem from the subject. In a way that almost anticipated Immanuel Kant, Aristotle reasoned that any experienced imperfection in what must be a perfect nature resulted from our imperfect or obscured viewing. The fault isn't in God's world, but in ourselves, since we are lesser beings. That's one reason sin is shame, and half of the reason Adam and Eve cover their nakedness upon breaching God's commandment. We'll ask in our next segment, what's in a name? Here, let's compare two parallel characters, Mina Purefoy, on the verge of her material creation, and Philip Beaufoy, whose spiritual, that is, artistic production, earned him some small fame and a little cash. These productions, both spiritual and material, participate in a process closest to what Sir William Ross calls Aristotle's concept of theology. Actual things, particulars, can be improper, a pagan's version of the Christian's evil. On the other hand, universals and things yet to be actualized only participate in the first cause, that legacy of the prime mover. In Joyce's metaphor, Mina's true creation produces a child, a thing that is yet again open-ended, and hence another universal. Phillips won him a prize, some cash and recognition, and exhausts its usefulness as Bloom's bathroom tissue. Aristotle goes on to explain how improper behavior willfully disregards the greatest good by degrees, from incontinence, weakness of will, to vice, product of a moral choice, and lastly, bestiality, behavior devoid of a soul. Eve's disobedience combined the first two, leading to her pain in childbirth and Adam's agrarian lifestyle. Yet, if her sin was explicit, what remained implicit was Eve's great boon to humanity, her curiosity.